Hello, this is Diane Dalton. In this lesson we are going to discuss the startup process for Windows. The startup process begins with several steps. They're listed here. I've articulated them, separated them into 6 different steps. The power on self-test, an initial startup phase, the bootloader phase, test and configure hardware, the kernel loading phase, and then the logon phase. We're also going to discuss at the end of this how to modify the startup process. So just to give an overview, there's a lot of things that happen after you turn on your computer or after you do a restart. There's many different files that are involved and there's many different services that are initiated. This lesson is going to explore each of these in some detail. And step 1, this is when you power on your computer, the CPU will go through and it will load the BIOS. That's the basic I/O system that enables the computer to do some initial configuration with some of the hardware. And the first thing it does is a self-test. It looks through the system hardware. It determines exactly how much RAM, or random access memory, is available. It verifies that the minimum devices that it needs to boot are working, which includes your disk, your monitor, and your keyboard. Then it loads some configuration settings from the CMOS. That's where the variables for the BIOS are stored. If you recall from our Intro to Operating System class, we can make some changes to the BIOS and those get saved. That gets saved in the CMOS. During this phase, during the power on self-test, what you see on your screen is a lot of white text on a black screen, and most of it goes by so quickly you can't actually read it. In step 2, the initial startup begins. So the BIOS has read these parameters that are in the CMOS and it has to determine the boot device order. If you recall, in the Operating System Concepts class, NOS 110, we actually looked at changing this boot order. What I have here is 1, 2, 3 is a typical boot order, but we had discussed taking DVD and USB out of there and putting hard disk first so that somebody could not boot your computer from a removable media. So this is what the BIOS has to do, is determine what's the order, and then it goes to look for a bootable operating system. So when it's booting from the hard disk, first thing it needs to do is find the master boot record, or MBR, and it's going to find that always in the first sector. It's reading the executable code from the MBR, and this is called boot code. The boot code's job is to actually identify whether or not the file system is a NTFS or a FAT32. It's not likely to be anything older than that in a Windows 7. And then it's going to find a bootloader file. The operating system begins to take control and it loads the bootloader. So it initializes the file system and then it finds where the operating system files are stored. That's usually going to be on your C partition under Windows and System. Now the bootloader process changed drastically between Windows XP and Vista and 7. So if you are in a position where you need to work with a older computer that's running Windows XP, what I'm explaining to you does not apply to that system. You'll have to do some internet research, but we're not going to cover that because it is becoming obsolete. So in the Windows Vista and Windows 7 bootloader, the bootloader is called the boot manager, and it contains a bunch of configuration information for Windows, and that's contained in something called the boot configuration database, or BCD. The bootloader is a file called winload.exe. It's an executable. And I know this sounds like many levels of indirection, but you've got to realize we start with the BIOS and it gets a very simple boot code, which then finds a program called winload, which is the bootloader, to actually load the operating system. Alright, so we take a pause kind of from the operating system. Windows goes out and determines what hardware is there in the system. And it creates a hardware list, and that's going to eventually go into the registry. And it might configure some settings at this point. Step 5 is when the actual operating system kernel gets loaded into memory, and it's going to get loaded from whatever location was identified in the BCD, or the boot configuration database. And what you see on your monitor at this point is the Windows logo screen. It had been blank for a while, and now you see the Windows logo screen. Other things that are happening in step 5 are the system portion of the registry gets loaded, your device drivers are configured, your kernel takes over, and it's reading the registry and looks at other settings, starts some of these other systems that run in the background, including the winlogin.exe. And step 6 is the logon phase, and several things are happening simultaneously at this point. There's several services that are started in the background. The Service Control Manager, which is called services.exe, and the Local Service Authority. At this point now you will see the logon screen. There's some program startup. These are for your programs that start up automatically, and perhaps some scripts for starting up non-critical services. The system also goes through the plug-and-play detection and installation for any additional hardware. I know that's been pretty quick. I'm going to go through it again in a more graphical way. So I'm going to refresh your memory from the NOS 110 class. We looked several times at this disk management, which you can find under the computer management. And this is showing the disk partitions. For a Windows system, it always creates a system partition, and that's the first one you see. Then there's also the C partition. When we boot a Windows system, that becomes the active partition, or the C, and that actually holds your boot sector and your operating system kernel. All right, so I'm going to start stepping through this. Step 1 is the power on self-test. Now I'm using some symbols. I'm using the CPU and the RAM, or just some simple boxes, and in the CPU I'm trying to describe what's happening. In the RAM I'm going to put in some of the data that we need to learn at this point. And the monitor on the right, I'm trying to demonstrate what the user actually sees. During the power on self-test, you will see white text on a black screen. The first thing you have to do is read the actual BIOS operating system. That's on a read-only memory. So that gets read into the CPU and it runs the self-test. Then it actually gets some of the settings for the BIOS out of the CMOS chip. Remember, if you change BIOS settings, that's where it gets saved. On to step 2. What we're doing now is the BIOS is using that boot order, and it's looking to find which one of those devices actually has a bootable operating system. Go with the assumption that it's going to be on the hard disk. BIOS is using that hard disk, and it's looking for the master boot record, which is in sector 0, or the system partition. And what it needs to do is read the partition table to find out where the other partitions are, and which one holds the Windows operating system that it's looking for. Reading that data into memory. Now we're into the bootloader phase. What we have to do now is figure out, okay, we know where the partitions are, what type of file system does it have? In this case, it's an NTFS, which is the latest that's being used in Windows systems. So we know what the partition table is, and we need to go into that NTFS file system now and find the bootloader. It would be in that operating system partition, and we load that into the CPU. So that's a new program that's going to run. One of the next things we do is to actually go out and what hardware do we have, and we're going to build a list and we're going to hold it in our RAM. So we have a hard disk, we have a monitor, we have a keyboard, we have a mouse, and perhaps we have some speakers too. So we've built up our hardware list. That was step 4. Now we're going to go load our kernel. This is where we actually read the kernel into the CPU. And where do we find that? We find the kernel on the C partition of the hard drive. It's in a file named ntoskrnl.exe. So that gets loaded into the CPU. Some other services get started up. Next we go into the logon phase, and what that's doing is it's starting up some services. It's actually initializing the device drivers or installing more sophisticated ones. If you recall, in the beginning, the output to the monitor was all just white text on a black background. So this is where the more sophisticated graphics driver for that monitor gets installed and initiated. So we're installing these device drivers for each piece of hardware that we have. That steps you through how you start up the operating system. Let's look at how you might want to modify that. If you need to make any changes, the way to do that is from the System Properties page. You can look at Advanced System Settings. You get a dialog box and go to the Advanced tab. Click on the Settings under Startup and Recovery. That brings up another dialog box where you can look at some different settings that you can adjust. Now you can select what's the default operating system, and if you have only one operating system installed on your disk, that's going to be the default. But as we had in our NOS 110 class, where we had 2 operating systems installed, Windows 7 and Windows Server 2008 R2, you might have one or the other as the default. You can also set the time that it displays that list where you're able to make the choice. So these are a few settings. Now these settings relate to what happens when you have a system failure, but they're also on that same page. Now that was only a few things that you can change from that page. but as usual for the real technical experts, there's more ways to control whatever's going on. There's a tool called bcdedit.exe. You have to run that in a command prompt, and you have to run the command prompt as an administrator. So when you hit the Start button, do a right click on the command prompt and select Run as Administrator. If you run bcdedit with no options, you get the list of settings, and you can look through these. And I've matched up a couple of these to that dialog box that you looked at earlier. The Windows 7 is the default. You can see that's the match. You can see the delay time to wait for someone to select something other than the default. You can see it's reported here. Now, if you need to make changes, there's a lot of different options here that can help you change different settings. To find out how to use bcdedit, you type bcdedit space /?, and you get the list of commands that you can work with within bcdedit. One particular example that I've run here, bcdedit space /? space /timeout. Again, this is how you run the command to change that timeout before you accept the default. So it would be bcdedit space /timeout space. So now you've seen two ways to change that timeout. There's many other things that you can change through the bcdedit. We're not going to go into every one of these. There are many things that happen, summarized in 6 key steps as the computer starts up. These are all preparing the hardware and the operating system to be ready to work. You can make changes to that startup through either the Startup and Recovery dialog box or using bcdedit. And as with regedit, you need to use extreme caution when you're making any changes to the boot configuration database.